All right, this is Sean Durns with CAMERA, the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis. And I'm joined here by my colleague, Dexter Van Zile, who is the Shillman Research Fellow for CAMERA. And we're going to be discussing a couple recent articles that Dexter wrote regarding Rick Steves that appeared in Allgemeiner and Times of Israel. So, Dexter, thanks for joining us today. You've written a piece in the Allgemeiner about Rick Steves, the travel show producer for PBS. CAMERA has produced a number of articles about Steves in years past. What brought him back onto the agenda?
There's a website called stopantisemitism.org that highlighted a video that Rick Steves had made and posted sometime in October of 2019. It was a presentation that he had made at a Lutheran church in Palo Alto, California. And essentially, he talked about his experiences as a travel journalist in the Holy Land, and essentially, and also a little bit about Iran. And so what happened was is that the folks at stopantisemitism.org called him anti-Semite of the week, and they also called him a bigot blogger, or the bigot blogger. And it was a pretty tough challenge, but when I watched the video in its entirety myself after the blog entry came out, I was kind of, shocked and bothered by some of the things that I saw in that video. So I felt compelled to kind of dig into deeper into some of the issues that the folks at stopantisemitism.org had uncovered.
Excellent. And I understand that one of the things, per your recent Times of Israel article, I believe it appeared March 20th, that Steves did that seems particularly gross, for a lack of a better word, is his comments regarding the Baha'i. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Sure. The Baha'i are a religious community that was founded in the 1800s by a prophet that he was a Shiite Muslim. And what happened was that he established a faith. His name is, and I'm probably going to mispronounce it, but it's Baha'u'llah. And forgive for the mispronunciation, but essentially he founded a religion that promoted unity among all humanity and also affirmed the underlying truths of all of the world's major religions, saying that they were divinely inspired, or that they had a truth that was divine in origin. And because this religious community came into existence after the Prophet Muhammad revealed his truths back 1,400 years ago, it's a blasphemous religion to the Shiite Muslims in Iran, and they are terribly badly treated, and they've been subjected to some terrible acts of violence over the course of history, particularly since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And during his video presentation, while he was speaking to these Lutherans who were, sitting in the safety of Palo Alto, California, he said, is the oppression that they're enduring, is it a nice thing? No, but am I okay with that? And he said, yes, I am. And you can watch the video yourself.
The big challenge for us is, there's lots of prophets. Muhammad, for Muslims, Muhammad is the last prophet. Jesus is a prophet, and Jesus is fine and dandy. But Muhammad is the last prophet. Now, if you have a religion where your prophet is after 650 or whenever Muhammad lived, let's say you're a Baha'i, and you consider Baha'u'llah your prophet who lived in the 1800s. For you to worship him is blasphemy, and you can be killed. So, is that nice? Not really. But is that okay? I would say yes, it is.
And when I watched the video, I was shocked. And he said, look, if you have a religion that was founded after the arrival of Muhammad, who the Muslim world think is the last prophet, you're going to be in for some suffering, and maybe you need to keep a low profile and get out of the country.
If you happen to be a Baha'i in Iran, keep a low profile or leave. You see, a lot of us are just up in arms because of that, but I just think that's the way Islam is. And we're not going to change it. You can't tell them to mellow out.
And one of the outrageous things is that if you read make even a cursory view of Baha'i history, one of the things that the Baha'i in Iran have a difficult time doing is getting exit visas. So essentially, he was telling the Baha'i to do something that legally they have a difficult time doing. And so I really was profoundly shocked by that. So we did a tweet graphic of it, and I've written 2 articles about it because I want people to see his indifference towards the suffering of the Baha'i in Iran. I'm not okay with his indifference.
Now, what? So it's clear the Baha'i are persecuted in Iran. What's their status in Israel? Can you talk about that at all?
Now, that's an interesting thing is that they have the Baha'i World Center in Haifa, which is one of the places that I visited. I went there in 2014, and the garden, it's just beautiful. In Israel, they have religious freedom. The Baha'i have religious freedom, and their World Center is located in Haifa. And essentially, it's outrageous that essentially Rick Steves would kind of ignore the suffering that they endure in Iran, and even worse, make light of it.
So it sounds like the comparison between the treatment of the Baha'i in Israel versus that in Iran is night and day. Can you recount Steve's attitude towards Israel for our viewers that might not be familiar? He seems to apply a stern moral standard against it, which seems to be only leveled at the Jewish state.
Right, and this is one of the things that our colleague Steve Stotsky has been able to document in articles that are available at camera.org. But it's essentially what he does is that he downplays Muslim and Arab and Palestinian hostility towards Israel and emphasizes the impact of Israeli self-defense measures.
Because Israel can shut down the border just because they're shutting down the border today. Israel does very just mean-spirited things. Is it for security, or is it just to break the spirit of the people who live there? I don't know.
And he seems as if, and he's a typical, and I don't really like using this phrase, but he comes from a mainline Protestant community, which over the years is always, and always is maybe a too strong a word, but almost invariably exhibits more outrage over Jewish self-defense than attacks on Jews. What he does is that he wants people to emphasize why people might want to murder Israelis or attack Israel, but he really downplays his efforts to empathize with the Israelis when it comes time to understand why they might have built a security barrier. He will reference in passing and say, okay, the barrier, it's understandable, but he doesn't go into much detail about the suffering that the Israelis endured, say, during the Second Intifada prior to its construction. And then when he talks about Baruch Goldstein's murder of 29 Arabs at the mosque in Hebron, he calls him a deranged gunman. Okay. Now, the thing is, I don't really expect or even want people to exhibit too much empathy towards Baruch Goldstein, because he was a terrorist. I think the Israelis pretty much understand that. But the thing is that if you're going to call for people to empathize with Palestinian terrorists, then you really shouldn't, then.
So it seems like a lot of empathy for a lot of selective empathy for Palestinian terrorists, none for Israelis, none for Baha'i. So why the double standard when it comes to the Jewish state? And do you think Stop Anti-Semitism's accusation that Steves is the anti-Semite might be legit, or is that an overstatement?
Well, you see, now that was the problem, is that, I think ultimately he gave him a lot of evidence to indicate that he had a problem with Jewish power. And I think that's really kind of the hallmark when you're talking about the Arab-Israeli conflict. We see this a lot with the so-called Christian peacemaking community that I think he's allied himself with, is that essentially he's bothered by Jewish power. And one of the things that he said during his talk in Palo Alto was that you couldn't broadcast his PBS show in New York because it called Palestine. And essentially he was suggesting that somehow the Jewish community or the pro-Israel Jewish community in New York was able to prevent PBS stations from broadcasting his TV show.
And New York, kind of a whistle, a dog whistle sorts for Jews in that particular context, right?
I think that's fair to say. And the thing is that another thing is that during the talk, he talked about how Israeli infrastructure was all paid for by the American people. But it's not as if he really addressed the whole issue of the American aid to the Palestinians, some of which, or a lot of which, actually ends up in the hands of families of people who've murdered Israelis.
Right.
And so it's kind of like, okay, well, what's going on here? And so, yeah, I think he gave the people at anti-semitism.org a legitimate opening to kind of charge him with a bigotry and a certain animus. He has an animus towards expressions of Jewish power that you don't see. And one last thing is that what he does is that he basically promotes the cause of Palestinian statehood without really acknowledging that Palestinian elites deny the Jews the right to self-determination. And so he's affirming a cause that denies what for its opponents what it claims for itself.
So there's definitely a clear, it's fair to say there's a clear double standard here.
Yeah.
Which, of course, is always one of the hallmarks of anti-Semitism, as the Soviet dissident and Israeli cabinet minister Natan Sharansky has highlighted. So is it hubris or is it ignorance that hinders Steve's reporting on the Middle East, or both?
Well, I think, well, first of all, you got to remember he's a travel writer, and he's made a living basically flying in and out of countries and basically providing some sort of impressionistic overview to his folks who are his audience. And on one level, that's perfectly legit because that's what travel writers do. But the thing is that superficiality coupled with hubris is really bad. It's a really difficult thing to overcome, because what happens is that he promotes this notion amongst himself and his audience that somehow that that he and his audience could come up with a much more reasonable response to the challenges that Israelis face than the Israelis do have themselves. That's really, and that's the mainline Protestant worldview is that whatever problems you're facing, those of us who live here in the United States, we would know better what to do than you do.
A sort of neo-colonialism in its own way on an intellectual level.
Yeah.
So I'd like to piggyback on something you just said. What is going on between Steve's and his audience? What's the payoff for folks to buy into his superficial portrayal of the Arab-Israeli conflict?
I think one of the things is this feeling of superiority. And ultimately, and also it basically helps people kind of transcend the guilt that they have over being basically rich white Westerners living in the United States. Here in the United States, we have what I would call dumb moral luck. We have tremendous moral luck living here in the U.S. And essentially and when you compare the life that we enjoy here and the freedoms that we enjoy here, and then you look at the suffering that is endured by people outside the United States, it's hard not to feel some measure of guilt, and you have to figure out a way to respond responsibly to that. And I think one of the things that he does is that he gives people a narrative of that they can luxuriate in. They can think, well, we live here in the United States. We enjoy this dumb moral luck. But if we were facing the same conundrums or dilemmas that, like, say, the Israelis do, we would do such a better job of responding to them. And the thing is that one of the ways that people can demonstrate that they're worthy of the dumb moral luck that they enjoy is by beating up on Israel. If you want to prove that you're opposed to colonialism, you beat up on Israel. If you really want to demonstrate just how committed you are to the cause of peace and justice, you can go into the West Bank, you can protest against Israel, you can go into Jerusalem and protest against Israel, like if you're an activist with the World Council of Churches. And then you can hang out at a restaurant that evening at like Emek Raphaim, and know that you're going to be able to have access to some of the best hospitals in the world if you need the help. And the thing is that you're also going to be untouchable in the West Bank because you're a Westerner. And so I think this is theme park human rights activism that I think that Rick Steves embodies. And that's a major part of the mainline Protestant worldview as well.
So one final question for those listening. If people are offended by Steve's justification for mistreatment, persecution of the Baha'i in Iran, is there something that they can do? Can they contact PBS? What would be some next steps?
Well, the first thing I would encourage them to do is I would encourage them to watch some of his shows on YouTube because they're all available. And one of the things that they should do is watch the one that he did in Iran because there was a factual misstatement in that one. One of the things that he said is that the Zoroastrian community in Iran can worship freely, when in fact during the Iran-Iraq War, they were forcibly volunteered, so to speak, or involuntarily enlisted in the suicide campaign. They were basically forced to be suicide bombers against the Iraqis. And that's a factual misstatement that can be brought to the attention at the PBS ombudsman. There's a public editor there. And you can say, look, this is something that needs to be fixed. And I also think that people need to call up their local PBS stations and say, look, some of the stuff that this guy has produced about the Holy Land in the Middle East is inaccurate. And you need to tell the folks higher up in the PBS organization that this is a problem. And you know, I think that's really important. It's also important, I think, that to tweet at Rick Steves, if you've got a Twitter account, and say, what's the deal here? What were you doing? Because he hasn't responded to any of the challenges that I've leveled at him. And I think he's hoping to be able to kind of just ride this one out. Maybe he was just vamping for the audience. Maybe it was just an unreasonable, maybe it was a gaffe or but the problem is that I think he needs to be challenged on this.
Dexter, for joining us. We appreciate it very much and wish you all the best. And thank you very much for our viewers for tuning in.
All right. Thanks. Thanks for having me.